Hello, billionairettes. How you doing? My name is Vanessa Black, and I'm excited to continue to dive into this awesome book, Daring Greatly, by Brené Brown. We are on chapter 2, Debunking the Vulnerability Myths. Are you ready to debunk some vulnerability myths? Well, I'm excited to hear these myths, and we're going to have two parts to this particular chapter. This is going to be part one. All right. So let me dive right into it. I don't want to waste any more time. So happy and grateful and excited that you are here, and we are going to grow together within the next 25 minutes. So, well, shall we? Let's do it. Yes, we are totally exposed when we are vulnerable. Yes, we are in the torture chamber that we call uncertainty. And yes, we're taking a huge emotional risk when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. But there's no equation where taking risk, braving uncertainty, and opening ourselves up to emotional exposure equals weakness. Myth number 1: vulnerability is weakness. The perception that vulnerability is weakness is the most widely accepted myth about vulnerability and the most dangerous. When we spend our lives pushing away and protecting ourselves from feeling vulnerable or from being perceived as too emotional, we feel contempt when others are less capable or willing to mask feelings, suck it up, and soldier on. We've come to the point where rather than respecting and appreciating the courage and daring behind vulnerability, we let our fear and discomfort become judgment and criticism. Vulnerability isn't good or bad. It's not where we call a dark emotion. It's not what we call a dark emotion, nor is it always a light, positive experience. Vulnerability is the core of all emotions and feelings. To feel is to be vulnerable. To believe vulnerability is weakness is to believe that feeling is weakness. To foreclose on our emotional life out of a fear that the cost will be too high is to walk away from the very thing that gives purpose and meaning to living. Our rejection of vulnerability often stems from our associating it with dark emotions like fear, shame, grief, sadness, and disappointment. Emotions that we don't want to discuss, even when they profoundly perfect the way that we live, love, work, and even lead. What most of us fail to understand, and what took me a decade to research to learn, is that vulnerability is also the cradle of the emotions and experiences that we crave. Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It is a source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If we want greater clarity we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path. I know this is hard to believe, especially when we spent our lives thinking that vulnerability and weakness are synonymous, but it's true. I define vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. With that definition in mind, let's think about love. Waking up every day and loving someone who may or may not love us back, whose safety we can't ensure, who may stay in our lives or may leave without a moment's notice, who may be loyal to the day they die or betray us tomorrow. That's vulnerability. Love is uncertain. It's incredibly risky, and loving someone leaves us emotionally exposed. Yes, it's scary, and yes, we're open to being hurt. But can you imagine your life without loving or being loved? To put our art, our writing, our photography, our ideas out into the world with no assurance of acceptance or appreciation, that's also vulnerability. To let ourselves sink into the joyful moments of our lives, even though we know that they are fleeting, even though the world tells us not to be too happy lest we invite disaster, that's an intense form of vulnerability. So let me repeat that. To let ourselves sink into the joyful moments of our lives, even though we know that they are fleeting, even though the world tells us not to be too happy unless we invite disaster. That's an intense form of vulnerability. The profound danger is that, as noted above, we start to think of feeling as weakness, with the exception of anger, which is a secondary emotion, one that only serves as a special, socially acceptable mask for many of the more difficult underlying emotions we feel. We're losing our tolerance for emotion and hence for vulnerability. It starts to make sense that we dismiss vulnerability as weakness only when we realize that we've confused feeling with failing and emotions with liabilities. If we want to reclaim the essential emotional part of our lives and reignite our passion and purpose, we have to learn how to own and engage with our vulnerability and how to feel the emotions that come with it. For some of us, it's new learning, and for others, it's relearning. Either way, the research taught me that the best place to start is with defining, recognizing, and understanding vulnerability. What really brings the definition of vulnerability up close and personal are the examples people shared when I asked them to finish the sentence STEM. Quote, vulnerability is blank. Here are some of the replies. Sharing an unpopular opinion, standing up for myself, asking for help, saying no, starting my own business, helping my 37-year-old wife with stage 4 breast cancer make decisions about her will, initiating sex with my wife, initiating sex with my husband, hearing how much my son wants to make first chair in the orchestra and encouraging him while knowing that it's probably not going to happen. Calling a friend whose child just died, signing up my mom for hospice care, the first date after my divorce, saying I love you first and not knowing if I'm going to be loved back, writing something I wrote or a piece of art that I made, getting promoted and not knowing if I'm going to succeed, getting fired, falling in love, trying something new, bringing my new boyfriend home, getting pregnant after 3 miscarriages, waiting for the biopsy to come back, reaching out to my son who is going through a difficult divorce, exercising in public, especially when I don't know what I'm doing and I'm out of shape, admitting I'm afraid, stepping up to the plate again after a series of strikeouts, telling my CEO that we won't make payroll next month, laying off employees, presenting my product to the world and getting no response, standing up for myself and for friends when someone else is critical or gossiping, being accountable, asking for forgiveness, and having faith. Do these sound like weaknesses? Does showing up to be with someone in deep struggle sound like a weakness? Is accepting accountability weak? Is stepping up to the plate after striking out a sign of weakness? No. Vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. Truth and courage aren't always comfortable, but they're never weakness. Yes, we are totally exposed when we are vulnerable. Yes, we are in the torture chamber that we call uncertainty. And yes, we're taking a huge emotional risk when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. But there's no equation where taking risk, braving uncertainty, and opening ourselves up to emotional exposure equals weakness. When we ask the question, how does vulnerability feel? The answers were equally as powerful. And I'm going to share the answers. It's taking off the mask and hoping the real me isn't too disappointing, not sucking it in anymore. It's where courage and fear meet. You are halfway across a tightrope, and moving forward and going back are both just as scary. Sweaty palms and a racing heart. Scary and exciting, terrifying and hopeful. Taking off a straitjacket, going out on a limb, a very, very high limb. Taking the first step toward what you fear the most. Jumping across the video live. It feels so awkward and scary, but it makes me human and alive. Being all in, a lump in my throat and a knot in my chest. The terrifying point on a roller coaster when you're about to tip over the edge and take the plunge. Freedom and liberation. It feels like fear every single time. Panic, anxiety, fear, and hysteria, followed by freedom, pride, and amazement, then a little more panic. Burying your belly in the face of the enemy. Infinitely terrifying and aching necessary. I know it's happening when I feel the need to strike first before I'm struck. It feels like free falling, like the time between hearing a gunshot and waiting to see if you're hit, letting go of control. And the answers that appeared over and over in all of our efforts to better understand vulnerability, question mark, naked. Vulnerability is like being naked on stage and hoping for applause rather than laughter. It's being naked when everyone else is fully clothed. It feels like the naked dream. You're in the airport and you're stark naked. When discussing vulnerability, it is helpful to look at the definition and etymology of the word vulnerable. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the word vulnerability is derived from the Latin word vulnerare, meaning to wound. The definition includes capable of being wounded and open to attack or damage. That's good. Merriam-Webster defines weakness as the inability to withstand attack or wounding. Just from a linguistic perspective, it's clear that these are very different concepts. And in fact, one could argue that weakness often stems from a lack of vulnerability. When we don't acknowledge how and where we're tender, we're more at risk of being hurt. Psychology and social psychology have produced very persuasive evidence on the importance of acknowledging vulnerabilities. From the field of health psychology, studies show that perceived vulnerability, meaning the ability to acknowledge our risk and exposure, greatly increases our chances of adhering to some kind of positive health regimen. In order to get patients to comply with prevention routines, they must work on perceived vulnerability. And what makes this really interesting is that the critical issue is not about our actual level of vulnerability, but the level at which we acknowledge our vulnerability around a certain illness or threat. From the field of social psychology, influence and persuasion researchers who examine how people are affected by advertising and marketing conducted a series of studies on vulnerability. They found that the participants who thought they were not susceptible or vulnerable to deceptive advertising were, in fact, the most vulnerable. The researchers' explanation for this phenomenon says it all. Quote, far from being an effective shield, the illusion of invulnerability undermines that very response that would have supplied genuine protection. One of the most anxiety-provoking experiences of my career was speaking at the TED conference in Long Beach that I referred to in the introduction. In addition to all the normal fears associated with giving a filmed 18-minute talk in front of an intensely successful and high expectation audience, I was the closing speaker for the entire event. For 3 days, I sat and watched some of the most amazing and provocative talks that I've ever seen. After each talk, I slumped a little lower in my chair with the realization that in order for my talk to work, I'd have to give up trying to do it like everyone else, and I'd have to connect with the audience. I desperately wanted to see a talk that I could copy or use as a template, but the talks that resonated the most strongly with me didn't follow a format. They were just genuine. This meant that I'd have to be me. I'd have to be vulnerable and open. I need to walk away from my script and look people in the eye. I'd have to be naked, and oh my God, I hate naked. I have reoccurring nightmares about naked. When I finally walked on the stage, the first thing I did was make eye contact with several people in the audience. I asked the stage managers to bring up the house lights so I could see people. I needed to feel connected. Simply seeing people as people rather than the audience reminded me that the challenges that scare me, like being naked, scare everyone else. I think that's why empathy can be conveyed without speaking a word. It just takes looking into someone's eyes and seeing yourself reflected back in an engaged way. During my talk, I asked the audience 2 questions that reveal so much about the many paradoxes that define vulnerability. First, I asked, how many of you struggle to be vulnerable because you think of vulnerability as weakness? Hands shot up across the room. Then I asked, when you watch people on the stage being vulnerable, how many of you thought it was courageous? Again, hands shot up across the room. We love seeing raw truth and openness in other people, but we're afraid to let them see it in us. We're afraid that our truth isn't enough, that what we have to offer isn't enough without the bells and whistles, without editing and impressing. I was afraid to walk on that stage and show the audience my kitchen table self. These people were too important, too successful, too famous. My kitchen table self is too messy, too imperfect, too unpredictable. Here's the crux of the struggle. I want to experience your vulnerability, but I don't want to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is courage in you and inadequacy in me. I'm drawn to your vulnerability, but repelled by mine. As I walk on the stage, I focused my thoughts on Steve, who was sitting in the audience, my sisters back in Texas, and some friends who were watching live from TED Active, an offsite location. I also drew courage from something that I learned at TED, a very unexpected lesson on failure. The vast majority of folks whom Steve and I met during the 3 days leading up to my talk spoke openly about failing. It wasn't unusual for someone to tell you about the 2 or 3 ventures or inventions that had failed as they explain their work or talk about their passions. I was blown away and inspired. I took a deep breath and recited my vulnerability prayer as I waited for my turn. Give me the courage to show up and let myself be seen. Then, seconds before I was introduced, I thought about a paperweight on my desk that reads, "What would you attempt to do if you knew you could not fail?" I pushed that question out of my head to make room for a new question. As I walked up to the stage, I literally whispered aloud, "What's worth doing even if I fail?" I honestly don't remember much of what I said, but when it was over, I was back knee deep in the vulnerability hangover again. Was the risk worth it? Absolutely. I am passionate about my work and I believe in what I've learned from my research participants. I believe honest conversations about vulnerability and shame can change the world. Both of the talks are flawed and imperfect, but I walked into the arena and gave it my best shot. The willingness to show up changes us and makes us a little braver each time. And I'm not sure how one measures the success or failure of a talk, but the minute I was done, I knew that even if I flopped or drew criticism, it had been totally worth doing. In the song Hallelujah, love is not a victory march. It's a cold and it's a broken hallelujah. Love is a form of vulnerability, and if you replace the word love with vulnerability in that line, it's just as true. From calling a friend who's experienced a terrible tragedy to starting your own business, from feeling terrified to experience liberation, vulnerability is life's great dare. It's life asking, are you all in? Can you value your own vulnerability as much as you value it in others? Answering yes to these questions is not weakness. It's courage beyond measure. It's daring greatly. And often the result of daring greatly isn't a victory march as much as it is a quiet sense of freedom mixed with a little battle fatigue. Myth number 2, I don't do vulnerability. When we were children, we used to think that when we were growing up, we would no longer be vulnerable. But to grow up is to accept vulnerability. To be alive is to be vulnerable. Madeleine L'Engle. The definition and examples that you just read make busting the second vulnerability myth a lot easier. I can tell you how many times I've heard people say, quote, "Interesting topic, but I don't do vulnerability." It's often buttressed by a gender or professional explanation. I'm an engineer. We hate vulnerability. Or I'm a lawyer. We eat vulnerability for breakfast. Guys don't do vulnerability. Trust me, I get it. I'm not a guy or an engineer or a lawyer, but I've spoken these exact words 100 times. Unfortunately, there is no, quote, "get out of vulnerability free" card. We can't opt out of the uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure that's woven through our daily experiences. Life is vulnerable. Look back at the list of examples. These are the challenges of being alive, of being in a relationship, of being connected. Even if we choose to stay out of relationships and opt for disconnection as a form of protection, we're still alive, and that means vulnerability happens. It's extremely helpful to ask ourselves the following questions. Okay. When we operate from the belief that we don't do vulnerability, it's extremely helpful to ask ourselves the following questions. If we truly don't know the answers, we can bravely ask someone with whom we are close, and they'll probably have an answer, even if we don't want to hear it. Number one, what do I do when I feel emotionally exposed? And if you're listening in, you can answer quietly to yourself. You can write it down. What do I do when I feel emotionally exposed? Number two, how do I behave when I'm feeling very uncomfortable and uncertain? Number three, how willing am I to take emotional risk? Before I started doing this work, my honest answers would have been, and I'm going to share her answers. One, scared, angry, judgmental, controlling, perfecting, manufacturing certainty. That was for what do I do when I'm emotionally exposed. For number two, the question, how do I behave when I'm feeling very uncomfortable and uncertain? This was her answer. Scared, angry, judgmental, controlling, perfecting, manufacturing certainty. And number three, how willing am I to take emotional risk? Her answer was at work, very unwilling if criticism, judgment, blame, or shame was possible. Taking emotional risk with the people I love was always mired in fear of something bad happening, a total joy killer that we'll explore in the Armory chapter. This questioning process helps because, as you can see from my answers, regardless of our willingness to do vulnerability, it does us. When we pretend that we can avoid vulnerability, we engage in behaviors that are often inconsistent with who we want to be. Experiencing vulnerability isn't a choice. The only choice we have is how we're going to respond when we are confronted with uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. As a huge fan of the band Rush, this seems like the perfect place to throw in a quote from their song Free Will. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. In chapter 4, we'll take a closer look at the conscious and unconscious behaviors we use to protect ourselves when we believe we're not doing vulnerability. That's page 45. And that's going to conclude part 1 of the myths of vulnerability. Those two myths, one was I don't do vulnerability. That was the one we just did. And the first one was vulnerability is weakness. Both of those are myths. Would love to know your thoughts. If you answered those 3 questions, we'd love to know if you want to share your responses. And yeah, that concludes. What a great 2 myths that we definitely went over. And I'm excited to get into number 3. Myth number 3, let's see how many are there here. We got number 3, number 4, 2 more. So we'll dive into the next 2. See you in the next Read With Me session, and hope you have a beautiful rest of your day. Take care.